This week, I sit down with Russell Starlack, a recent graduate of Carleton College who did his senior thesis on residential segregation and Black-Jewish relations in Minneapolis in the 1950s and 60s. Our conversation ties into a current TC Folk series about how Minneapolis Jews benefited from systemic real estate racism. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So here's the background. This is, I think, the first episode of the Jews Are Tired podcast that is directly connected to a piece of TC Folk reporting. In this case, a whole series called Exodus and Equity about the movement of Twin Cities Jews from North Minneapolis to the suburbs in the mid-20th century. Now, you might be wondering, if you haven't read the series, why this is an important subject to be covering. And the answer is that this Jewish migration to suburbia is actually part of the story of modern inequality in Minneapolis and other Midwestern cities today. Studies have shown that Midwestern cities have some of the largest Black-white homeownership, education, and employment gaps in the country, and one study even called the Midwest, quote, among the very worst places for African Americans to live, end quote. And Black poverty today is often concentrated in formerly immigrant and Jewish city neighborhoods, one of which, in Minneapolis, is a region called Near North in North Minneapolis. Near North is where most of the Twin Cities Jewish community lived in the early 20th century before mostly relocating to St. Louis Park in the 1950s and 60s. This relocation happened at the same time as the Great Migration was bringing more Black people into the Twin Cities. Now, to just be clear about this is not a story of Jews deliberately getting together to create inequality in the city. What this is a complex story of how a set of racist real estate policies played out in Near North. These policies trapped the Black community in Near North, drove the area into long-lasting poverty, and helped Jews get to the suburbs. And to be even clearer, these policies played out across the country, also in areas with very few Jews, and the overall history of this systemic real estate racism is a lot bigger than the Jews. But there is still this distinct history in neighborhoods like Near North, so that's what we're diving into. To get into the nitty-gritty of how these policies played out and what that really means, please check out the podcast notes, visit tcjewfolk.com, and read the series. I'm not going to get into all the details here because that would make this episode far too long, but I do want to clarify what I'm talking about just a little bit more, because it is absolutely relevant to understand the conversation Russell Starlack and I had. So one of the key racist policies to understand is something called redlining. Redlining is when banks refuse to give a loan to someone based on where they live or who they are. And when I say someone, what I mean here is Black people. Redlining was a policy designed to exclude Black people from loans based on the assumption, which I have to clarify is a false assumption, that Black people will automatically decrease the property value of any neighborhood they live in. Again, this is not true, but it was a driving assumption of this policy. So a very much summarized version of what happened in Near North with the Jewish and Black communities thanks to redlining goes a little bit like this. The Black community in Near North, not given loans to buy a house, was left mostly renting and unable to benefit from homeownership, which is one of the primary ways in this country to gain wealth and stability. They also couldn't leave Near North, for the most part, thanks to redlining restricting where Black people could buy houses. The Jewish community, on the other hand, was given loans to buy houses, in this case often in white suburbs like St. Louis Park, and left Near North without a problem. In St. Louis Park in the 1950s, a nice house could cost around $10,000, and that house would then appreciate in value to around $200,000 by the year 2000. So one group of people benefits from homeownership and another does not. Why? Well, because of these racist policies like redlining. Again, I'm skipping over a lot of details for the sake of getting to the point in this episode, but as redlining played out, it impoverished Near North, and it did so very quickly. Jews were also leaving very quickly. Sometimes this was driven by St. Louis Park being a nice, new, open place to live, and sometimes the Jewish movement was explicitly driven by fear of Near North deteriorating, which was often blamed on Black people rather than policies like redlining. So this is where we reach the conversation with Russell Starlack. Starlack researched this history in Near North and St. Louis Park and was essential to my being able to report and write this series. And much of the work Starlack did and the documents he dug up were about Black-Jewish communal relations in Near North, as the neighborhood was changing and communal leaders tried to manage the anxiety around that. Those relations involved tension over civil rights work and efforts to stop the real estate discrimination that was segregating Minneapolis. The same real estate discrimination that, through policies like redlining, created a lot of the inequality still present today. Jews like to have this nice idea of the Black-Jewish Civil Rights Alliance in the 1950s and 60s. And this, in part, is a story of how that alliance fell apart in Minneapolis. The conversation with Starlack has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. So first, I want to ask you about your thesis itself, which is titled Close to Home, Suburbanization, Residential Segregation, and Jewish-Black Relations in St. Louis Park and North Minneapolis. So let's just start with, how did you end up researching the story of Jewish movement from Minneapolis to St. Louis Park and the inequalities that came along with that movement?
I should say, first of all, I'm not a native of the Twin Cities and of the Twin Cities Jewish community. I grew up in south of San Francisco, in Palo Alto, California. I went to school right across the street from Stanford University. But growing up, I was very, very aware of how limiting housing can be as a way, and how housing can sort of serve as this barrier to integration. So my town, Palo Alto, was very diverse. But despite that, in Palo Alto, there wasn't a lot of economic diversity. Our median home value right now is like $2.8 million. And so, that's just impossible for most Americans, I would imagine, to live here. So, and, at the same time, our town, we really looked at ourselves and we saw ourselves as this very diverse, liberal, tolerant, community. And so that sort of warring, those two warring sort of realities of living in a liberal community, but also, that is very culturally diverse, but not economically diverse, is sort of at the core of my experience growing up. And so I knew, as I I veered sort of more towards trying to understand sort of where I came from, and how living that world sort of meshes with my Jewish identity. I came to really understand that so much of who I am really comes from this legacy of massive housing discrimination, going back, through the most of the 20th century, and something that continues to today. And that's why I wanted to understand that a little bit more. And of course, I had to start really just looking at myself and my family. My dad's grew up in Durham, North Carolina. Both his parents were Jewish. His mom is my grandmother is basically from the Catskills. My grandfather grew up in Brooklyn. And they moved to the city of Durham in the mid to late 50s, but they relocated out of the city into the county in 64, 60, probably a little after 65, 66, when the schools were just desegregated. And so that is also my legacy. I am, my life, my family's history has been shaped by, housing inequality and this very complex relationship that many Jews and just generally white families who have, bought and sold homes in America have with, systemic racism and particularly systemic racism around issues of housing. Because, in this country, housing is, your home is what is often your biggest economic asset, and it's what you can pass down, from parents to children, and it's a way of building intergenerational wealth. And the harsh reality is that that's something that white families were able to do, and something that Black families have largely, and other families of color have not been able to do, simply because of their race. And so all of that sort of is a broad background to me saying that I knew that I wanted to really, whatever I wanted to do for my thesis, I really wanted to look at housing discrimination and that history in a very deep way. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is, how did I, end up focusing on the Twin Cities? And I wanted to do a project that could be a little bit more public facing, and that wouldn't just sort of sit in, the library at Carleton, for, to be preserved. I wanted something that, that would be public facing and that could potentially have an impact on local community. And so, I sort of was like, well, yeah, let's see what kind of stories are, around in the city, to look at. And so I, last summer I had a conversation with, the person who would become my academic advisor for this project. And I was like, basically, I told you my plan, which was basically to pick a random suburb in Minneapolis or St. Paul and sort of just drill, as deep as I could to look at housing segregation. And she basically just started listing off suburbs, some places I had never heard of, Golden Valley, Edina, Hopkins, all of the things. And she said St. Louis Park and mentioned that it had this, big Jewish character, association with it. And I was like, okay, that's really interesting because, my own background, I thought a little bit about my relationship as a white person and housing segregation, but the relationship between myself and my Jewish identity and housing segregation was not something that I had really thought that much about. And so I was like, no, that seems like a really interesting project. And the more I looked into it, the more potential I saw to really make an impact because, much like Palo Alto, St. Louis Park also has this very liberal, identity, as this tolerant, welcoming community. But at the same time, it was part of a region that today has some of the largest disparities in racial outcomes in the nation. And so, there's this big gap between the self-perception and, the reality, or at least, there was before June. And, it made me realize that I think someone really needed to look into this and write about it. And so I'll tell you, so one of the first emails I sent out to was to, I'm not going to give a friend's name, but someone who worked for a local public history organization. I basically said, hey, I'm a college student. I'm like trying to look at this history, in St. Louis Park. And they wrote back and they told me, it's interesting that you're looking into this, but I'm not sure what you're going to find in St. Louis Park because, before 1970, there were not enough Black people here to discriminate against. So, is the way that people looked at things, right? We have this divide between de jure, right, segregation by law, that's what we think of like Jim Crow, and de facto segregation, which is like segregation that just like happens for some reason. But of course, that's de facto segregation is kind of a myth. Like there's always a reason why you're going to have this level of disparity. But people just didn't want to look into it. And so, that was sort of my challenge. And I sort of was like, all right, let's see what I'm going to find. And, I ended up finding a lot of stuff that I had no idea, would be in the archives, but it was.
So let's then get into some of what you found. And I want to focus on some of the stuff that you found that didn't find its way into the series so much. Specifically, how Jewish communal leadership responded and thought about the neighborhood change that was happening in North Minneapolis in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And while that's, to be fair, a big subject in and of itself, a lot of that conversation revolves around one character in particular that you became very friendly with through the archives, if I can put it that way, Samuel Shiner. So tell us, who is Samuel Shiner, and why is his story so important to understanding what happened in North Minneapolis and St. Louis Park?
Yeah. So, friendship, friendly is a good descriptor, of this work. And I should preface this by saying that, when you spend, weeks on end sort of locked in the basement of some random library somewhere, you sort of, you come across these people, and a lot of what the historian's work is, I have found, is to try to sort of empathize with, these people that you found, like, in a way, not necessarily sympathize with, their trouble, that may be part of it, but sort of you're trying to get inside their heads and sort of understand what was going through their minds when they committed the words that they did to, the paper that you're finding now. And that became the basis of my analysis of Steiner, was trying to sort of understand where he was coming from, because he's such a key player in this history. He's such an interesting person. And so Shiner was the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota, basically from like the late 30s, early 40s to the early 70s. He is director of, arguably the most important Jewish political, social organization in the Twin Cities. And that's a huge period. And was sort of great for me because, I was coming into this, that was exactly the period that I wanted to look at. So he was sort of the perfect lens for me to view this story. And, the other thing you have to understand about Shiner is he really didn't give me a choice about making him the center of my narrative, because he shows up everywhere. I mean, he was an extremely prolific writer. He would write to newspapers constantly. He would write to other organizations and constantly other politicians. And so he just shows up a lot in the archives. Even when I'm not even searching, he's always there. And so he was the director of the JCRCM. I would say the other thing to really know about Shiner and many Jews of the Twin Cities in this generation is that he had a very intimate relationship, I guess, with anti-Semitism, and he had a lot of experience, as did that entire community. In the 20s and 30s, the Twin Cities were seen to be one of the most anti-Semitic regions in the country, and Jews faced a lot of discrimination, specifically employment discrimination. And part of the reason that community was forced to set up its own economic institutions, shops in its own neighborhoods, and really became this really tightly knit ethnic enclave in the pre-war period, just to survive. And Shiner comes from that. That was his childhood, was experience of that anti-Semitism. And so, I think always with Shiner, you have to understand that he saw community relations and managing that relationship as kind of this almost like life or death, situation where, if he failed and did not, paint the Jewish community in as good and as positive of a light as possible for, the Gentiles in the area, they could risk, another surge in anti-Semitism, and potentially lose some of the progress that had been gained by this community in the years after World War II. And so he was very sensitive as a result to any whiffs of anti-Semitism coming from anyone in the Twin Cities. And that was, I think, not just a Shiner thing. I mean, certainly we have, his record, but I think this community that emerges after World War II was, that history was not that distant for them. And, they were very aware and very sensitive to anti-Semitism.
Well, so I guess what I would then ask you is to, can you get a little more specific on what's the lens you saw through Shiner's experience of what was happening in North Minneapolis and St. Louis Park with this Jewish movement?
Okay, and and the other thing is, Shiner also saw himself very much as part of the civil rights movement. People talk a lot about sort of this golden age of an alliance between Jewish organizations and Black civil rights organizations around civil rights in the 50s and early 60s. And Shiner, I think, saw himself as part of that moment, and especially early on, did a lot of work to, with the Urban League and the NAACP to support, those causes and advocate, within Minneapolis, to fight discrimination. That being said, he also covered up instances of Jewish discrimination, as early as the 40s. There was, some instance where a Jewish restaurant, I cannot remember where it was, refused to serve some Black customers, and Shiner sort of tamped that down in the 40s. That's just one instance. And so I think you really have to understand in a sort of outlook on race and race relations. And, like many other, similar white and Jewish civil rights activists and Black activists of that time, Shiner was really grounded in this philosophy of liberalism, meaning what true equality means, as far as recognition goes, is having equal access to the market. And this became very popular because it's a great way to sort of critique Jim Crow. If you are denied access to a lunch counter in the grocery store or pharmacy because you're Black, you do not have equal access to that market. And so this really becomes the way that Shiner and many others sort of view civil rights, and it's the way that they come to view the housing market, where success was when Blacks had the same opportunities to buy homes in given neighborhoods, without actually critiquing and understanding the flaws in the market itself. So it's a kind of a fine distinction to draw, and there were certain inequalities that Shiner was able to acknowledge and try to work sort of solve in the market. But there were some things, in the way some programs and some really deep fundamental issues around policy and the way that the housing market was shaped to be, in such a way to be so exclusive to people of color that Shiner's, liberalism just could not sort of account for, and as a result, he could not address. And I think, many Jewish liberals and white liberals in the Twin Cities, that was the same. That was sort of blind spots that they all had.
And so let's dig into some of what that meant for North Minneapolis in terms of community relations between the Black community and the Jewish community. So in your thesis, you recount this story of Shiner, who, when it came to advocating against housing segregation in the 1960s, apparently said that the Jewish community shouldn't, quote, lead the integration parade, end quote, which James A. Tillman Jr., the Black executive director of the Greater Minneapolis Interfaith Fair Housing Program, did not take well. And so now I want to ask you to, if you can, read some of Tillman's response that you found, and then if you can, give us more context to sort of what that core conflict was about. In the sense that, to me, part of the importance of revisiting this history is that the civil rights era in the Jewish community is sort of held up and mythologized in a lot of ways. But it seems like we need to understand, in looking at this history, that it isn't as shiny as we often want to think it is. And if I remember correctly, this exchange between Tillman and Shiner happened in 1963, around abouts there, which is the same year as the famous March on Washington, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So, carrying all of that and sort of the duality of the way that Jews tend to think of ourselves in the civil rights era, what can we understand from this Shiner-Tillman exchange and the tension around housing segregation?
This really gets, I think, at the heart of a lot of these issues that I think are still unresolved for many American Jews today. The fact that Jews, tend to, I have the example I always give is, it's like, I remember being taught from a very young age, Heschel marched with King, and that, showed that Jews generally supported civil rights. But at the same time, many Jewish communities and many whites sort of view civil rights and that struggle as something that was past. We did it. It's fine. We can pat ourselves on the back and sort of just go about our business. And so you see the beginnings of that idea and that attitude in Shiner's statement, we should not lead the integration parade. So to understand this statement, we have to talk about something that in academia is a process called whitening. And this is the idea that, when Jews and the Irish and Italians, many of those immigrant groups from Eastern and Southern Europe that sort of flowed through Ellis Island, when they first arrived in America, they were not seen to be white in the way that individuals of Anglo descent were. But over the course of especially the first half of the 20th century, many of these groups sort of became white, and they did it through a myriad of different strategies. Perhaps one of the biggest events around sort of changing the racial status happened beginning with FDR's presidency. The New Deal, one of its goals was to sort of create this new unified white class that could support this massive program. And so that was really one of the first times that the government really counted Jews as white, by the realtors who were sent out to canvass different areas and take surveys of who was living in these different neighborhoods to draw the basis of what would become redlining maps. So Jews were sort of on the white side of the red line versus the side in which many other immigrant groups and people of color and communities were placed in. And as a result, they would be much more likely to be approved for home loans by banks and for mortgages than people of color. So that happens. And the other big thing that happens, of course, is World War II, and in the aftermath of which, there's a very conscious the realization of the extent of anti-Semitism. And to a certain extent, there are attempts made to sort of redress that. After that moment, many Jews, my grandfather among them, went to school, under the GI Bill and moved out to, many suburban communities that were being built as a result of housing acts passed in the end of the 40s to, address a massive housing shortage in the nation. And so that's sort of at this moment, beginning in the late 40s, early 50s, that you have Jews moving to the suburbs and really for the first time integrating themselves spatially into white communities. And Shiner was very much a part of that. He was sort of trying to manage this. A lot of his early work in St. Louis Park was actually around making sure that Jewish holidays were observed in public schools. And so that the calendar, sort of adapting the calendar and just sort of making sure that teachers, whatever, were sensitive to these new Jewish students that they needed to teach in these suburban schools. But one of the many problems with whitening and having that sort of dynamic is that these Jewish communities and these new Jewish suburbanites, their status was based on the opinions of their white neighbors, right? They needed to be accepted by these communities in order to, be part of the community and, live social lives. And to do that, the sense was you could not be too provocative. You couldn't be too Jewish. There was a cost to this newfound status as white, which is that you need to be accepted by your neighbors. The values that your neighbors had for the first time versus, in a urban Jewish neighborhood like North Minneapolis were going to be very different than the values that you were raised with. So that's happened, over the course of the 40s, 50s. And in Minneapolis, by 1963, most of the Jewish population had left North Minneapolis, meaning that, most were probably in the suburbs or, in a suburban community and were dependent on that acceptance. Hence, I think that is probably what was informing Shiner's statement that Jews should not lead the integration parade, because at that point, civil rights and whitening, they had done their work. Jews were integrated. Now, the concern was to not stand out.
Coming back to Tillman's response to Shiner, can you sort of read from that response? And again, sort of nail down, you gave a really broad background to the conversation of what that was about, but can you give more context to how these conversations were happening in North Minneapolis specifically? Because this isn't, I imagine, the first sort of tension around this between someone like Tillman and someone like Shiner in North Minneapolis.
So this is I'm going to read a couple paragraphs. Sam, I do hope that you had an opportunity to think through and reconsider both the implications and consequences of your statement that you do not wish the Jewish community to lead the integration parade. You will remember that you made this statement at a meeting about 2 months ago. I hope that you now see the wisdom of advising people in the Jewish community that they should act as other committed Americans in the pursuit of equal opportunity in the field of housing. The meeting on the 20th of April, 1963, may be useful in indicating fundamentally sound reasons why all committed people, Jew, Christian, Black, and white, should act together to erect an open society with respect to equal opportunity. Of course, you know that I do not share your implied feeling that Jews should be reticent, apologetic, or timid about being committed to or working actively for equal opportunity in housing for minority peoples who happen not to be Jewish. I know and have worked with Jewish people who, acting as other Americans, are willing to count themselves among the leaders of integration. I do not believe that the unique minority status of the Jewish population in America should be a deterrent to their working from the open society for all. It seems to me that Jews will commit the error of acting as if their own rights should be contingent upon the sufferance of other groups, if they permit their perceptions of their own peculiar status to encumber their active and practical pursuit of justice. The rights inherent in American citizenship cannot and must not be viewed as the consequence of the largesse of any other group. To possess efficacy must be viewed as rights. So someone sees this and that peculiar status of Jews, as sort of existing between sort of whiteness and blackness and trying to sort of navigate their new political surroundings in the suburbs. That's sort of what Tillman's talking about. So to sort of be very specific about, what was happening in North Minneapolis and places like St. Louis Park, North Minneapolis had been, of course, the center of Jewish life for the better part of, a half century by the 1950s in the Twin Cities. But at the same time, in the 50s, there was this growing realization that because of the Great Migration, and because that neighborhood was probably one of the few in Minneapolis that was not covered by housing covenants and therefore not as protected against quote unquote threat of new Black homeowners arriving, this new population of African Americans arriving because of the Great Migration were steered into North Minneapolis. And this created a lot of tension and anxiety. Shiner, demonstrates and writes about this a lot, of that Jewish community, over the future of that neighborhood. And as a result, this is the same time that the suburbs are opening up. Jews begin to, many Jews leave. And so they make this journey, the same one that my grandparents did, from the city to the suburb. And there were a couple of ethnographies that were written about this community. And they're very open about the fact that they're moving to St. Louis Park because they are concerned about the African American population. This is something that Shiner is anxious about, not just, because he definitely has those demographic fears, but also because he is a committed integrationist. But he does not have the tools because of the way that, of sort of his liberal mindset. His mindset doesn't give him the tools to understand that the housing market that Jews are a part of and the housing market that African Americans are part of are two different markets. He doesn't necessarily understand that there are real policies that are creating this, situation in which this rapid translation and white flight is pretty much the only possible sort of conclusion from having these two different groups who are part of two different housing markets. And so as a result, that's why he's not as quick to act and be as strident with, issues around housing, because, it's such a personal issue for the community. And there doesn't seem to be, he doesn't not even necessarily grasp the extent of the problem. The other thing to note too, and we should talk a little bit about Tillman, because Tillman is his own fascinating character. James Tillman was director of the Greater Minneapolis Interfaith Fair Housing Program. He is not a native of the Twin Cities, unlike Shiner, who was, but he was Black. And he actually very publicly experienced his own struggles trying to find a place to live, move his family to, in Minneapolis when he was first hired. And, he begins his tenure as the director of the Interfaith Fair Housing Program with a very similar mindset to Shiner. He was very much, a believer in liberalism and the idea that, the whole fair housing sort of philosophy was that the housing market is unequal because white homeowners don't want to sell homes to Black homeowners, and just because they're racist, and that their racism is sort of this illogical thing. Whereas in reality, what we know is that white homeowners do not want to sell to Black homeowners because doing so would invite in this whole other market that would decrease the value of said neighborhood. So there was a very logical reason.
So I want to ask you to sort of, when we're talking about this idea of the liberalism that got in the way of understanding sort of what was happening with the housing market, can you sort of go in and tie those pieces together a little more clearly in the way you're talking about liberalism?
Yeah. So, Shiner's and Tillman's liberalism, was this idea that the problem of housing segregation was a problem of attitudes, that people did not want to integrate their neighborhoods because, they didn't want to, and that basically white homeowners could be logicked into accepting integration in their neighborhoods. Whereas in reality, it was, redlining, discrimination by banks, meant that opportunity to integrate white neighborhoods was simply just not on the table for many homeowners of color. Shiner never really leaves that paradigm, but Tillman does. Tillman begins to understand the extent to which all of the institutions in the Twin Cities are sort of united to try to prevent residential integration. And that makes him he is seen to be one of the sort of foundational figures of the Black radical movement that would emerge in North Minneapolis and in the beginning, in the middle, and really peaking at the end of the 1960s.
So I also want to ask you then, how, from what you found, how did the relationship between Shiner and Tillman change as we get to the late 1960s, as we get to the unrest on Plymouth Avenue, where a lot of these pressures come to boil? Because it's sort of, when reading your thesis, you had a lot of info of sort of the early 1960s when there seemed to be a lot of communal conversation around that, and then it just sort of disappeared. So I'm wondering, did Shiner and Tillman stay in touch as all of this was going down in the late 1960s?
It's interesting because I think the last contact I have between Tillman and Shiner at all is one of those is around that 1964 period. I do know that at that point, I think the interfaith housing program, I think had the governing body of it, I think had decided that the program had run its course, and that, in the view of the mainly white, churchgoers who sort of had supported the movement, it was sort of seen to be, we've done it, civil rights bill was passed in 1964, we passed our own state fair housing law in 1962, we're done. We can wash our hands and move on to other things. But Tillman stayed, and Tillman taught some courses at the University of Minnesota. It was at that period that I think he began to really question his liberal views and really focus a little bit more on sort of white racism, realizing that it is this very obstinate enemy that really needs to be addressed. And I think, perhaps beginning to understand the weight of the institutions behind this, massive residential segregation. Some of the people that attended, some of his students, would go on to found The Way, which big community center in North Minneapolis that really became a focal point for Black nationalism and Black radicalism in the late 1960s. Tillman had some association with them later on as well. It's unclear. I couldn't quite figure out the nature of that relationship and for how long it lasted. But certainly, I think Tillman, it's really important because I think Tillman is not a sort of a unicorn in this sense. I think he's actually emblematic of a lot of Black civil rights workers who were very involved with racial liberalism and that golden era of civil rights. And then, because of, growing disillusionment, the way that the movement shifted, did transfer and become much more involved with Black militancy. And in our collective discourse, we often write off the later 60s as a time where, civil rights, it sort of crossed the line in that, okay, now because of the rhetoric that's being put out and some of the methods being used, that this is a whole separate group of people that we're dealing with that really can't be dealt with in the same way that we could deal with the nonviolent civil rights movements. And that's certainly Shiner's viewpoint, as the 60s wear on.
So then the last question I have for you is pretty broad. We've covered a lot of different threads of some of the relationships and the driving attitudes around some of the Black-Jewish relationship, at least on a leadership level in North Minneapolis. And when it comes to the impossible task of boiling down what you've learned about Jewish movement from Minneapolis to St. Louis Park and the leadership tensions around that, what are your main takeaways for approaching this history and learning from it? To the Jews facing this for maybe the first time they're doing a deep dive of all this information, what's sort of the bullet point of what should people take away from this?
So I think the first thing to take away is sort of something that perhaps would be rather surprising, which is that while I've looked a lot, obviously, at sort of Jewish-Black relations, it's really important to remember that it wasn't just Jews and Blacks that were living in North Minneapolis. North Minneapolis was a very diverse neighborhood. There was a large Irish population, a large Scandinavian population, and some of the oral histories that period, pre-war period, attest to this. I think it's important to, first of all, understand that, as the case with many other sort of old urban Jewish neighborhoods, these neighborhoods were much more diverse than we give them credit for. North Minneapolis was also a much more dynamic environment. Some of the work I've done with Mapping Prejudice shows that North Minneapolis had been sort of moving in relation to African Americans for most of its history, and it actually sort of shifted up from being centered on 6th Street, which is now the Olson Highway, to being centered on Plymouth Avenue. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway, I think, to think about is just thinking about sort of how we tell our history and why we tell our history the way we do. So actually, to talk about this, I have another document that I sort of brought up. It is, this is a memo that was sent from Castle Abelson, who was a very long-serving rabbi of Bethel, September 6th, 1961. So this is right before the Minnesota Fair Housing Law sort of took effect. Let's see, I'm going to read a section of this. So I'm confident that all of you know this is written to all of the various local rabbis in the Twin Cities. That effective December 31st, 1962, Minnesota's new law against racial or religious discrimination in the sale or rental of private houses will take effect. The new law will cover the sale or rental of all real property, including commercial space, vacant lot building lots with 3 exemptions. The subcommittee of the Jewish Community Religious Council of Minnesota felt it would be well if the Jewish community could be made aware of the passage of this law at the last session of our state legislature and to understand that it pertains to the future. As we look around the situation of the South as it pertains to integrating public schools, we see that where a community is properly prepared for the enforcement of a law or our constitutional rights, that serious trouble can be avoided. It is the committee's feeling, as well as mine, that if my colleagues would make reference to the Minnesota law sometime during the high holidays, when the greatest number of our people could be reached by a message from the pulpit, that we perhaps could do a most effective piece of work in educating our people to understand the law and how they will be affected by it. The Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the subcommittee wants it to be known that they are available at any and all times to the Jewish community in helping to solve problems which may arise and to avoid any Negro Jewish incidents which may harm the great reservoir of goodwill which we have labored so hard to build up in our state over the many years. So, this is a really interesting document, and I come back to it time and again because in many of the communal histories that I've, seen, biographies, even by, written by one of the co-authors, Robert Latz, of that bill, that era sort of fair housing legislation was seen to be sort of a boon for Jews. It allowed them to integrate the suburbs. It allowed them to sort of be accepted in other people's homes. But that communal narrative is false, right? The JCRCM at the time, Shiner at the time, was more concerned about Jewish backlash against that law. And so, that's intense, ask Abelson to, ask all the rabbis to, make that a part of their sermons for the holidays. And this shows, just how easy it is for communities to forget the painful parts of their legacy. And, it's something that I think is sort of just a human thing to do. We all do it. We all want to believe that, we live in a just world. But, obviously, we don't. The world is not, just. But, Judaism teaches us that we should work to try to achieve, a just world. And so, I think that, that really begins by confronting your own history. It's what I'm doing. It's what I've been trying to do with this whole journey, to try to confront the privilege that I have, my own family's history with housing segregation. And I don't think we can reach a point where we have this sort of alliance again between these different communities, no matter how focused we are on working for the same goals, until that history is acknowledged. That's, I believe, is the key to really reopening dialogue. And, if there's anything, any sort of theme around sort of this history that we've discussed, it's that dialogue that, is too narrow and that doesn't, encompass all of the, the extent of institutional racism and all of the sort of the contradictions around, Jewish community relations and self-perceptions. And their relationship to the Black community is not going to go anywhere, and that's sort of the tragedy of this history, is that, of course, by the end of the 1960s, we have, Jewish shops being burned by a community that had its, financial resources drained out, that have been forced to basically live in this one neighborhood and watch it transform into a ghetto. These two communities that, in another world could have perhaps inhabited the same space. There was a refusal on the part of the Jews to acknowledge their complicity in wiping out that potential future. It's interesting. Yeah, I guess we're running this story at an interesting time, because Yom Kippur is sort of the time to really think about our past wrongs and try to atone. So I would encourage, I guess, people listening to just sort of think about their own privilege and ways that they can work to promote housing justice. That's really what I hope people take away from this history.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.